Hey, I'm Daniel. This is the November to December Policy Ask topic analysis. The topic has to do with elimination of fossil fuels. Without further ado, let's talk about what exactly fossil fuel subsidies are. So the kind of federal, state, and local governments essentially give money to oil companies, to other fossil fuel companies, and that kind of and what that does is it kind of decreases their costs. And so this actually ends up being around $20 billion each year. It's done on multiple levels, right? So both the federal government and the state government can do it. A state like South Dakota, for example, with a large oil industry, might subsidize it more than a state like California, where there's A, less oil to be drilled, B, kind of not as much of a political incentive. Kind of the fossil fuel industry is heavily politicized both on the right and the left, especially kind of with oil tycoons like the Koch brothers and kind of large companies paying off parties, and then which makes it kind of a very salient topic for both politics advantages and disadvantages, as we'll see later. But before that, kind of a good, I kind of just want to give a good understanding of what subsidies and taxes are and what they're kind of ideally supposed to do. So, what a subsidy is that it decreases the cost of something, right? So you should think of a subsidy as a negative tax. And so these occur in kind of economics because of what's called an externality. And an externality is basically some type of cost or benefit that isn't included in the price of a good, but should be. So, for example, smoking is a negative externality because when I buy a cigarette, I don't care about the secondhand smoke that it could damage other people, the unpleasant smell, all of those things. And so cigarettes should be taxed because the current cost doesn't reflect the true societal cost, right? And so we want to kind of increase this price from here to here so we can decrease the quantity so that we can reflect the cost. This way, the benefit to the actual people is equal to the cost of all of society. An example of a positive externality is having a nice lawn because your neighbors like to look at it, and so we should subsidize people with nice lawns so we can encourage more people to have nice lawns. But the problem then is fossil fuels would seem to be a negative externality. Right? When you are buying gas for your car, you're not really considering the costs that it leads to things like congestion or global climate pollution or a bunch of other things. But the reason why it's subsidized, which would say that it has a kind of benefit to society, is because of political pressure from the fossil fuel lobby. And so there's kind of, instead of shifting the curve up, like it should in this diagram, the fossil fuel industry has actually managed us to increase the cost. So we're consuming more than is a socially efficient outcome in any sense. And so that kind of builds in an econ advantage almost. There are a few possible actors on the topic. The most obvious one is the federal government. These are apps that kind of model policy debate. They're like the United States federal government should. But even within there are a couple of questions that we have to answer, right? The first one being what branch of the federal government, and there are different advantages for each of these. First is the Department of Energy. So before I start this, any federal government affirmative will have kind of the big stick benefits, right? We could go for ending fossil fuel subsidies, collapses the industry, which causes a shift to renewables, which solves climate change. You can make some type of spending argument that says that subsidies are economically inefficient and so hurt the economy. You can make some type of you can make kind of really a range of questions. You can make a federalism bad argument, but specifically there are some advantages and disadvantages to choosing which branch of the government decides to do the plan. And so the kind of one that pops out is the Department of Energy. The reason for this is because of the fact that it is the executive, and so there are a couple of benefits. The main one is maybe advantages to things like Chevron or hour deference. Hour deference is basically the idea that when Congress passes a statute that isn't clear, agencies can defer and make those guidelines. And so any type of affirmative that is essentially ending fossil fuel subsidies by the DOE will probably invoke some type of deference. And so deference, our deference specifically, has recently been restricted by the court. And so these types of affirmatives would likely make some argument that says that A, agency specification is good, B, the plan, because of durable fiat, forces expansion of that deference. C, insert impact. And it's key to remember that obviously expression of deference to energy will spill over to other places like state or defense. So a common argument is that key kind of state breadth in interpretation of federal statutes is necessary for effective foreign policy, because we can't wait to ask Congress to deliberate every time we have to make a stat decision about whether or not we're going to drop a bomb or anything like that. And so having broad hour deference for state and defense are good ideas. And there's actually uniqueness specifically in this field right now, because the Supreme Court did just a rule to limit hour deference, and it looks like kind of these types of deference are gonna be on the chopping block, because it's something that Republicans think lead to big government. And so both Gorsuch and Kavanaugh have very publicly come out against these types of deference. The second actor would be the courts. Here, specifically mechanistically, we would get a slightly different advantage. The most likely one would have to do with some type of judicial legitimacy, an argument that says that that type of legitimacy is low right now, but the plan is able to increase that. There's also possible kind of court politics advantages. There are, for example, arguments that there are arguments that say that the Roberts Court needs to balance political capital, that they'll vote kind of one way on some issue like abortion right now, but the plan causes a flip. These are actually most likely more negative arguments, but the main reason to prefer the courts, right, kind of over Congress would be that you get to strike out of the politics decide. And so the courts, there's actually a case right now that's going on in front of the courts. I forget its name, but it does have to deal with ending fossil fuel subsidies. And so there's this kind of test case that can be used that says the Supreme Court can take on this case. The benefit is that it leads to kind of this larger precedent about government subsidies. You get your same warming advantages, which means that it can defend all the big stick advantages while still not linking to things like the politics decide or kind of process counterplans focused on that. There's also a built-in defense to the state's counterplan, because especially if you make test case good arguments, because the Supreme Court ruling through a test case, which is already kind of already making its way through the federal court system, is distinct from kind of the negative fiating all 50 states rule on something, and could set up a good kind of theoretical legitimacy / permutation argument, especially kind of with a topic that says United States. The state's counterplan will most likely be a core generic against federal government affirmatives. And then when you're deciding what actor, you also have to decide, do you want to specify federal government or a specific specification in the plan text? And here, there are kind of benefits to doing both. If you specify, you might be able to get out of some extra circumvention arguments, but in general, it's a good idea not to specify. And the reason to not specify here is because kind of a lot of counterplan competition, the affirmative would like to make the argument that counterplan competition for the actor depends on the words in the resolution, but then implementation is normal means, just like counterplans and disads link off of that. And so what that means is that the negative only gets disads off of the affirmative implementation. So if you have an aft that mechanistically uses a DOE or courts, but you say USFG, they don't get links to the politics decide. But because you said USFG, they also can't read actor counterplans, because permutation to the counterplan is a way that the affirmative could have been done. It's just not normal means, so it doesn't link to the disad. And so not specifying, even though you specify in your mechanism, right? Not specifying is a kind of good and important thing to have. The second actor, and one that is most likely going to be less popular just because of the way that the literature works, is state governments. And so all 50 states uniformly ruling, which you obviously get to do as the affirmative, maybe not the negative, because of the way that the resolution is written, are able to solve the same big stick advantages that we talked about earlier: warming, the economy, international legitimacy, etc. With, I think, two possible additional net benefits. So the first one is a federalism argument, particularly there's an argument that says that kind of this devolution of states' rights is necessary for a couple of reasons. One of them being, resolving warming and being more effective that way. There's also modeling arguments. Countries like Nigeria or Syria, although Syria is not maybe the most unique argument right now, but a country like Nigeria that's looking to form a government will look at the U.S. to determine federalism, and if the U.S. looks centralized, that makes it hard for places with a lot of kind of ethnic diversity and tension to form unified governments, which devolve into instability, which is kind of these modeling arguments. But there's also kind of like a court's legitimacy argument. The idea that the states can put a check on Trump, especially in climate legitimacy, gives the international community a sense of resolve and kind of idea that yes, institutions exist that currently check Trump, which can increase legitimacy and kind of American almost like pseudo soft power abroad. The state government argument could almost be better as an answer to the politics decide, kind of with a follow-on argument where the federal government eventually does the act just after the election or after whatever politics decide you're reading, because all 50 states have chosen to do this, and this obviously works on the negative and the affirmative as well. You kind of might want to think about the mechanistic arguments that occur. If you say United States you open yourself up to a lot of picks what could generate competition. For example, the state's counterplan pick would then be legitimate, and so it's most likely kind of not the best to defend a whole res act and at least specify between the federal and state governments, and then make kind of weird types of shifty counterplan competition disadd link arguments like we went over earlier. So kind of, we already went over this, but we can go kind of, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth into these now. So the first advantage that is very big stick is the warming advantage. So this advantage does link very much into almost econ advantages just because of the size of oil in American GDP. The argument would be that ending fuel collapses the industry, especially ending subsidies for fossil fuels in the United States. Because, like if we go back earlier to the supply and demand graph, it would increase the cost because currently subsidies are decreasing the cost. And so that increase in the cost would make oil unfeasible and allow for carbon neutrality. This kind of collapsing the industry argument also has some other arguments built into it. For example, you could say that collapsing large oil corporations can actually can cause kind of decreased instability in the Middle East, since it removes incentives to go in there as much, which means that Russia and the US stop using it as much as a proxy state. The second advantage, which can go both ways, is the econ advantage, right? There's obviously an argument that says that oil hurts the economy because it's inefficient, which is the externality stuff that I talked about earlier. And so then you can make econ collapse bad arguments. But the thing is, you can also make econ collapse good arguments, because you can say that collapsing the industry destroys the economy writ large. And so this can go either way. My recommendation is to think about whether or not you would rather debate DDEV or kind of debate an impact turn to DDEV, if you choose to read any types of these econ arguments. And of course, if you read the warming advantage, you kind of are already setting up like a pseudo DDEV argument. The politics argument is the final kind of politics advantage, which is maybe more disadvantage ground than advantage ground, would be built upon the idea that there's some type of coalitional building that occurs with fossil fuels. So, like, ending subsidies allows for moderate Republicans like Romney or Sass to be able to flip to the Democrats and show some type of bipartisanship. And that benefit could be something like winners win, which means that other things get passed, or something like that type of cooperation paves the way for impeachment talks, or it could go the other way, right? So there's a lot of possible politics around just because of the way that fossil fuel is politicized on this, both on the affirmative and the negative, and that's maybe a question that is better addressed in another TA or later. Kind of the final advantages are some that were talked about on the previous slide. There are intrinsic advantages to things like using education with our states and federalism, courts, etc. These are very important should you choose to specify a mechanism, because they implicitly guard against agent counterplans. Because a state's counterplan against a DOEF cannot solve the our deference argument even through follow-on, etc. It's just using these types of process counterplans. For example, having a two-advantage act with a big stick warming advantage and a kind of very specific process advantage makes counterplan arguments hard, which means that kind of the negative may always start behind when trying to read it this side. And so those are very strategic. Soft left AFs are not kind of, compared to the last topic, soft left AFs are not as rich of a topic area. There are pollution arguments. Two examples are the way that kind of climate policy intersects with things like racism or the settler colonial state, especially with things like the Dakota Access Pipeline, where the government was trying to kind of build something like DAPL or Keystone XL that goes through indigenous reservations. They arrested protesters, etc. And so that's kind of an argument for why ending fossil fuel subsidies would stop support for those industries and could be a form of negative state action that resolves or begins to resolve or have discussions about settler colonialism. Wake, I think AS read an app on the college policy topic that dealt with specifically the way that emissions work in the context of other things. The other advantage, obviously, for soft left apps is just the crazy stuff that U.S. oil companies do in places like the Middle East. If you read kind of a collapse argument, the obvious advantage around here is that the plan can stop that type of exploitation, which creates stability, but also stops the legacy of U.S. colonialism, imperialism, etc. There's and obviously there's less ground for these types of soft left apps, just because I think the util arguments are so much. There's so much more literature written about the util arguments, given the salience of climate change right now. But using an internal to pollution seems like it's a good starting point for a lot of similar fringes that have been written before, and can also have ground for things like Heideggerian apps about how kind of harvesting fossil fuel is a form of will to mastery or other things like that. So while soft left apps might seem less salient on this topic, there's definitely sufficient ground that anyone who wants to read something that explores maybe more critical literature but with a plan is good. And this is also good to keep in mind for people who are reading framework, because these types of soft left apps can often serve as very salient TVAs when you're debating chaos. And I think that's around it for the kind of policy ass topic. If you have any questions or want any specific cards regarding any of the affirmatives discussed here, feel free to send me a message on Slack.